Hello everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Awesome Albums with Awesome Andrew. And welcome to part 2 of what I'm calling the Summer of Pink Floyd. Last time we talked about Dark Side of the Rainbow, that phenomenon where you mix Dark Side of the Moon with Wizard of Oz. This time we are going to cover a Pink Floyd album that turns 40 years old this year. Now I admit, this was going to be a 2-part series on their 1979 album, The Wall, but there was so much information that this was definitely not a 2-parter video. This is definitely a 3-parter video at least. So what I'm going to do is similar to what I did on the Sgt. Pepper video and have an entire video dedicated to the history and making of the album and the album cover. Then next time talk about the music on the album, or at least the first half of the album. It is a double album after all. So let's get started, first introducing the band. Roger Waters, our primary songwriter and primary vocalist. He also plays bass, synthesizer, acoustic guitar on the song Mother and Vera, and electric guitar on Another Brick in the Wall Part 3. David Gilmour, our other vocalist, also plays electric guitar, bass guitar, synthesizer, clavinet, and percussion. Richard Wright on acoustic and electric pianos, Hammond organ, synthesizer, clavinet, and bass pedals. And Nick Mason on drums and percussion. Our story is going to start back in 1946. A very strange place to start. A 3-year-old Roger Waters is eagerly anticipating his father's return from World War II. Unfortunately, his father never came. His father, Eric Fletcher Waters, had already been gone for 2 years during the Battle of Anzio in Italy. But Roger wasn't able to process that. He said, "My mother told me I said to her at age 3, I'm going to go to Italy and get my father in a tractor. You've never seen quite so fierce a little boy as you were," she told me. She tried to explain that I couldn't go get my father in a tractor. Apparently, I looked at her and narrowed my eyes and said, "In that case, I'm going in a double-decker bus," and stomped off, which is kind of funny, but it's very sad as well, end quote. Now, you might be wondering, well, that's tragic, sure, but what does that have to do with The Wall? Well, everything. We're going to skip ahead to 1975, huge jump in time there. Pink Floyd just released their 9th album, Wish You Were Here, which was hugely successful, not as successful as Dark Side of the Moon, but still hugely successful. Roger Waters also divorced Judith Trim that year. Now we're in 1976, Roger Waters had remarried by this point to Caroline Christie. Meanwhile, Pink Floyd had placed their financial future in the hands of the investment company Norton Warburg. When James Callaghan's Labour Party raised the top rate of income tax to over 80%, Norton Warburg persuaded Floyd to invest in a range of ventures. I'll return to that statement in just a few minutes. Pink Floyd released Animals on January 23, 1977, were on the subsequent tour promoting that album. With the success of 3 huge albums in a row, they were playing in sold-out arenas. The final show of their In the Flesh tour was July 6, 1977, in Montreal, Canada. The band was getting exhausted, and the fans were unusually obnoxious, too. Roger Waters even spat at a particularly obnoxious fan who fired off a firecracker in the audience. I actually found some audio of Roger yelling at this individual.
Oh, for f***'s sake, stop letting off fireworks and shouting and screaming. I'm trying to sing the song!
And then supposedly here is the infamous spit. I can't hear it, but maybe you can, but this is supposedly when it happened. Kinda ironic that one of the lyrics in the song Dogs on the Animals album was, "Who was trained not to spit in the fan?" I'm sure we're talking about a different kind of fan here, but it's still kind of ironic. Roger hated playing in the big venues, hated facing the audience, hated his fans singing along. He hated the disconnect between the band and the audience that comes from large venues. For weeks he's endured chanting and yelling, noticeably during their quieter songs, which Pink Floyd is known for that, and had begun to yell at fans to shut up and other not very nice things. David Gilmour had his own concerns that night. The sound of the band's performance he felt was subpar. In protest, he refused to go out for the encore, leaving Snowy White to fill his shoes the best he could. They had planned to play Money and Us and Them, but played a blues jam instead for 60-plus thousand fans. That night, Waters injured his foot during a little tussle with manager Steve O'Rourke. It was during this recovery that he wondered why the show was such a disaster. He figured, for one, the audiences were too big and almost uneducated, like mindless animals, and 2, he was a musician, not a performer. He had fantasized dropping bombs on his crowd and declared he'd rather play behind a wall. Okay, now we're getting somewhere. He later said, I actually still have the drawing at home. Sitting on a plane or in a bar somewhere, I got a piece of paper and drew a picture of this wall across an area with a stage. When I did that, I got very excited. I thought, wow, what a great piece of theater it would be to do that. Actually, to construct a wall between the band and audience during a concert. End quote. Now let's move on to 1978. The band was kind of doing their own thing this year. Nick Mason was acting as producer for Steve Hillage and his album Green, released in April. David Gilmour and Richard Wright both made solo albums. David Gilmour released an untitled album, just called David Gilmour, released on May 25th. Richard Wright released Wet Dream September 15th, 1978. Meanwhile, Roger Waters was busy writing. He put together a 43-minute home demo tape of songs for a project called Bricks in the Wall. This project would focus on the alienation he'd experienced touring the world to a faceless audience. He said, I needed to construct a whole piece, so I started thinking, well, what is this wall and what's it made from? Then the idea started to occur to me that the individual bricks might be from different aspects of history of my life and other people's lives, and I started to fit things together, end quote. During that same time, he worked up a rough demo for another project, which became The Pros and Cons of Hitchhiking, which was a more intimate concept of sex, family, and modern living. When the band met up in July at Britannia Row to discuss album number 11, he presented both ideas. Ordinarily, they often collaborated and jammed ideas into songs and then albums, but this time the others were just artistically spent. So they decided it was one of Roger's ideas or nothing. So their vote was they all went with Bricks in the Wall. Although it wasn't a 100% positive vote, with little input from the band, the album To the Band seemed autobiographical, centered around Roger Waters' personal angst about audiences, touring, alienation, sex and relationships, and there was no other conclusion. David Gilmour said, we all thought it was a very strong concept. I think there's a lot of it that's irrelevant to me. I don't feel the pressure of a wall between me and my audience. I don't even think there's something that doesn't get through to them. I don't feel a lot of the things that happened to me in my earlier years, some of which weren't so wonderful, adversely affect my life to the extent Roger feels some of those things affected his life. Roger, for example, never knew his father. That's his viewpoint, and he's perfectly entitled to it. But I don't subscribe to it. A lot of the other stuff, The Dark Side of the Moon and Wish You Were Here, I am fairly in sympathy with. Animals I can see the truth of, though I don't paint people as black as that, end quote. Richard Wright said in a Mojo interview in 1999, there was some things about it where I thought, oh no, here we go again. It's all about the war, about his mother, about his father being lost. I'd hoped he can get through all this and eventually we can deal with other stuff, but he had a fixation, end quote. Wright also said, possibly if we were not in this financial situation, we might have said, well, we don't like these songs, and things might have been different. But Roger had this material, Dave and I didn't have any, so we'll do it. The financial situation that Wright is talking about goes back to the Norton Warburg investment that they made a couple years ago. Those investments they made, unfortunately, were a huge disaster. As a result, the commercial success of their most recent albums and sold-out concerts were basically ruined. They had lost over £2 million, which in US dollars is over $2,481,000, and that was back in 1979. Andrew Warburg, the founder of the investment company, had run away to Spain. He was later caught and served 3 years in prison after returning to England. One source said he returned in 1982, and another source said 1987. And that's why it was so important to make one of Roger's ideas come to life. They realized, we need to make an album if we're going to survive, basically. They began working in Britannia Row Studios in London to get this album made. Unfortunately, they couldn't stay there long. In order to avoid this tax issue, they needed to take up residence outside of England and record outside of England as well. So they went into tax exile from April 6, 1979 to April 5, 1980. Gilmour and Wright went to the Greek islands, Waters went to Switzerland, and Mason went to France. For the purpose of recording, they came together after initial sessions at France's Super Bear Studios, which Gilmour used to create his solo album. From there, they went to Los Angeles to complete the wall at Producer's Workshop. Bob Ezrin was brought in to help bring this album to life. You might recognize that name from my Alice Cooper videos. He also produced albums for Kiss, Peter Gabriel, and a long list of other artists. Waters played the demo for Ezra, in which all the music was strung together almost like one 90-minute long song and then some extra bits at the end. Ezra was intrigued with this idea and got to work. First figuring out the structure and what songs to cut out and still make a coherent story. Otherwise, this album could have been a triple album, and my series about it, Tetralogy, which is a 4-part series. Ezra said, "In an all-night session, I rewrote the record. I used all of Roger's elements, but I rearranged the order and put them in a different form. I wrote the wall out in 40 pages, like a book," end quote. Ezra also suggested to create a central character for the album to make it slightly less autobiographical, so the character Pink was created. Probably one of the biggest roles Bob Ezrin had to do was keep the peace between the band, especially Roger and David. "I probably was rather scary. I had the tendency to lash out," recalls an older, mellowed-out Roger Waters. David Gilmour said, "There's always tension, but it was all quite controllable until after the Wall album. There's such a thing as creative tension, and then there's total egocentric megalomaniac tension," end quote. The band didn't record together and relied a lot on overdubbing. Roger was in the studio from 10 a.m. to 6 p.m., Wright would be there from 7 p.m. to 1 a.m. Nick recorded his parts at the beginning of the session and entrusted them to Ezra and James Guthrie, the assistant engineer, at the instigation of engineer Alan Parsons, who was their sound engineer on Dark Side of the Moon. Richard Wright was absent on any writing credits on Animals and was conscious having little space to contribute on its successor, The Wall, with his musicianship squeezed out. He resented the influence of Ezra. Eventually, he persuaded Roger to let him co-produce The Wall, a decision that caused a lot of conflict between Wright and Ezra, as a result, working at nights alone. Summer of 1979, Roger Waters took a decision that proved the final straw for Richard Wright. U.S. record company Columbia Records offered the band a cash incentive to get the album out by Christmas. Waters agreed, Gilmour, Mason, and Ezra followed suit. Wright, however, refused. Waters asked Steve O'Rourke to call Wright and ask him to cut his vacation short. Wright was with his family in Rhodes. He said, "I haven't seen my young kids in months and months. I'll come on the agreed date," and then closed the conversation with saying, "Tell Roger to F off." Nick Mason said, "Rick," said Roger, "could stay on as a paid player for the Wall shows, but after that he was no longer a band member. If this was not done, Roger threatened to pull the plug on the whole enterprise. This sounded like a madman with a gun pointed at his own head," end quote. David Gilmour tried to stick up for him and said he wouldn't continue the album unless Richard Wright went. Waters said, "I made the suggestion that O'Rourke gave to Rick. Either you can have a long battle, or you can agree to this, and this was, you finish making the album, keep your full share of the album, but at the end of it, you leave quietly." Ooh, that's pretty intense. And there were also possible rumors of firing Nick too, although Roger doesn't remember saying that, except for possibly being a joke. Richard Wright's lack of contribution was probably one of the biggest reasons for Roger being short with him. David Gilmour said he had been asked if he had any ideas or anything he wanted to do. "We would leave the studio in the evening, and he would have the whole night to come up with stuff, but he didn't contribute anything. He just sat there, and it was driving us all mad," end quote. He also claimed, along with Waters, Ezra, Michael Kamen, composer, and Fred Mandel, a guest musician, that he himself had to record a fair number of keyboard parts. However, James Guthrie said he worked alone with Wright and maintains a large number of keyboard parts were indeed Wright's. Richard Wright, like I said, was conscious about his contributions to The Wall. For one, he was squeezed out musically, like I said, and also he was in the middle of a divorce. He said, "He might have seen my situation as not having contributed anything, but he wouldn't allow me to contribute anything," end quote. The Wall was finally released on November 30th in the UK and December 10th in the US of 1979. When the album was released, Richard Wright's role as producer was not credited. Although he is still credited as a member on the album, at least on my copy anyway, the album cost $700,000 to make. Bob Ezrin actually cried when this album was finished. He said, "Making that album was a very difficult job, but it was thrilling because it was such a pure vision. When I finally got all 4 sides of the record done and I can play them, 1, 2, 3, 4 in order, I broke down and cried because it was such a release. So many months in construction, pounding away and fighting with things, bending, adapting, and going without to get that final product," end quote. I get it. You're crying because you spent so much time on it, agonizing, and it's finally done. Now let's move on to the next section and talk about that album cover. As you see, the album is just a bunch of white bricks. The bricks continue on the back side of the album too. Certain copies of the album would include the lettering of the artist name and album title either on a sticker on the sleeve wrapping or printed onto the cover itself in either black or red. Mine must have been the sticker on the sleeve wrapping since there's no words on it at all, but that's okay. CD releases have the group name and album name just printed on there. Roger supposedly had a falling out with Storm Thorgerson, who had created Floyd's album artwork since 1968's Saucerful of Secrets. Thorgerson included artwork from the Animals album in his book Walk Away Renee, and Roger decided to work with someone else for the wall as payback. Roger turned to cartoonist Gerald Scarfe, who had worked with Pink Floyd for some animations during the In the Flesh tour. Waters really liked his work and pushed him to oversee the packaging of the wall. The font used for the wall is Scarfe's handwriting, and it is used on the front cover, the gatefold, and the record sleeves. From my point of view, it was a happy arrangement, because Roger in no way tried to impose himself on my work. We were working in separate fields, music and art, and yet the two helped one another. He saw the whole sleeve as being designed by me, but it was Roger's idea from the beginning that it should be a blank wall, end quote from Scarfe. Opening the album to look at the gatefold, we see more illustrations from Scarfe, and they're interesting anyway. What we are seeing are key characters from the wall's story. On the left side, we see the judge, who is basically a giant butt with eyes, the butthole being the mouth. There's a plane doing a nosedive toward the audience and marching hammers. Scarfe said, I had to think what would be the most obvious symbol of oppression, and the most unrelenting, crushing, unthinking thing that I can think of was a hammer. The violence of a hammer when it comes down is horrific, end quote. On the right side of the gatefold, we see the teacher, or schoolmaster he's sometimes called, Pink's mother, complete with the brick wall arms, and that other monster is Pink's wife. These characters will make a lot more sense throughout this trilogy, just stick with me. But as with any album an artist makes, there has to be a tour to promote it. There were 31 shows of the tour, starting at the Los Angeles Memorial Sports Arena on February 7th, 1980, and went until June of 1981. Band relationships were at an all-time low. 4 Winnebagos were parked in a circle with the door facing away from the center. Waters used his own vehicle to arrive at the venue and stayed in separate hotels from the rest of the band. The stage show was amazing. During the show, you have this 40-foot high wall that's being constructed out of cardboard bricks between the band and the audience. By the start of the second half of the show, the group is completely cut off from the crowd, save for a small section of the wall that's designed to look like a hotel room. Nobody home is basically what that is. During Comfortably Numb, Gilmour would ascend to the top of the wall for the guitar solo. At the conclusion of the show, the wall would collapse, revealing the group again. Oh, it's so cool. And you can't forget the inflatables. Like, you had the schoolmaster, and his eyes are lighting up and just glaring at the audience. And you have Pink's mother, and you can't forget the screen behind them with all the animations from Gerald Scarfe and his team. The tour, as you can imagine, was incredibly expensive. I'm talking $1.5 million expensive. Except for Richard Wright, who was only a touring musician now. Therefore, he didn't lose any money like the rest of the band. But the rest of them lost about £400,000, or say $500,000 basically. After the tour, Richard Wright was no longer a member and left the band. We did have some leftover The Wall material that was put towards almost a sequel that was known as The Final Cut in 1983. But I'm getting a little ahead of myself here. I didn't get a chance to talk about the movie. Yes, there was a movie made known as Pink Floyd The Wall, directed by Alan Parker. Alan Parker, fresh off the success of Midnight Express, was brought in to bring Roger's vision to the big screen. Filming began on September 7th, 1981. The lead role of Pink was played by Bob Geldof, singer of the Boomtown Rats, and almost immediately, there was trouble. For one, Geldof initially rejected the idea of playing Pink for the simple reason that he didn't like Pink Floyd's music, which is kind of a big deal if you're going to play in a Pink Floyd movie. His agent insisted that he read the script, however. This exchange reportedly took place in a taxi driven by Roger Waters' brother. Other problems that arose were Alan Parker and Gerald Scarfe began to clash. Scarfe said, "The trouble is, Roger and I had lived with this thing together for about 3 years. So when it came to the film, Roger didn't want to relinquish control. So there was me and Roger on one side and Parker on the other, and that's when the war started. End quote from Gerald Scarfe from the book Comfortably Numb. Roger said he found the movie excessively violent and lacking in subtlety. He even went so far to claim he felt little empathy for the character in the movie. Roger said, "I found it a bit difficult to watch in a sitting. I've become kind of numbed by it," end quote. Parker then fell into disgrace with Roger and the two never worked together again. Alan Parker reflected on the movie and said, "On reflection, Pink Floyd The Wall was quite the most miserable time I ever had making a film. It's a scream of pain from beginning to end," end quote. He also said, "To be honest, I never should have made Pink Floyd The Wall. The making of the film was too miserable of an exercise for me to gain any pleasure from looking back at the process." Although, one positive he took away from the movie was, "I wish I had $1 for every shot I've seen copied on MTV," end quote. The movie soundtrack had some significant differences from the album version. First off, you had 2 songs from the album that didn't even make it into the movie. One of them almost did, but Hey You and The Show Must Go On. Then you have Is There Anybody Out There, Bring the Boys Back Home, Mother, In the Flesh, and In the Flesh were re-recorded, and no, I'm not repeating myself from those last 2. And those last 2 featured Geldof singing lead vocals. Then you also have Run Like Hell and Another Brick in the Wall Part 2 were remixed, and 2 new songs were added. When the Tigers Broke Free, a single released in July of 1982, and also featured on the final cut, and another song called What Shall We Do Now, a song that ultimately got cut from the original album. The movie was first screened at the Cannes Film Festival on May 22nd and was released in France and UK on July 14th and in the US on August 6th, 1982. Later on in our story, after leaving Pink Floyd, Roger Waters played a one-night show in 1990 on a segment of where the Berlin Wall was, and the show was called The Wall Live in Berlin. The song The Tide is Turning from his second solo album Radio Chaos was included in the show as a way to inspire hope. From 2010 to 2013, Roger Waters gave The Wall a proper world tour. This show had a much wider wall, updated, higher quality projected content, and leading-edge projection technology. Even Gilmour and Mason joined him for one show in London at the O2 Arena. In a film of The Wall concert, Roger Waters' The Wall was released in 2015. In 2016, Waters adapted The Wall into an opera, Another Brick in the Wall, the Opera, with contemporary classical composer Julien Bilodeau, and it premiered at Opera de Montreal in March of 2017. It was produced by the Cincinnati Opera in July of 2018. It is orchestrated for a score of 8 soloists, 48 chorus members, and a standard 70-piece opera orchestra. And that was a lot of information I threw at you. And the story of The Wall essentially went from 1944 with the death of Roger Waters' father all the way to last year of 2018, but I'm not done talking about The Wall yet. Come back next time where we take a look at the first half of the songs on the album. I hope you are excited, because I'm excited, and I hope to see you in Part 3 of The Summer of Pink Floyd and The Wall Part 2. Catch you then.